Thank you so much to Senator Laird. And his office puts together an amazing newsletter, so if you're trying to stay up to date with all of these changes happening at the statewide level, I would really encourage you, hop onto his website, sign up for that. They've got an archive there of some of those past pieces too, and it's a great way to continue to stay in the loop and learn more. Next up, we have another amazing speaker, Martin Rizzo-Martinez, who's an associate professor in film and digital media at UCSC. Martin is a historian and assistant professor in the Film and Digital Media Department, and the author of a study of indigenous peoples of the Santa Cruz area. The title of that is We Are Not Animals, Indigenous Politics of Survival, Rebellion, and Reconstitution in 19th Century California. And he is also the co-producer of the podcast entitled Challenging Colonialism. Martin.
Thank you all. It's nice to be here. Thank you to Lori and Aaron for the invite and for everyone for putting this together. Yeah, I'm enjoying this, and I haven't been to this. I didn't realize this has been going on for 10 years now, but I'm excited to see it and to be here. So I'm going to talk with you a little bit about local indigenous history. Thanks for the great invite, so I don't have to introduce myself. You heard a little bit about what I do, but I've been working on local history for, 17, 18 years or so, working a lot with local tribes for that whole time too. So I'll give a little bit of history and talk about, local indigenous history, in particular the San Lorenzo, which is of course a very special place, as everyone here knows. The map that you see behind you here is a map that was originally made by the current chairman of the Amamutsin Tribal Band. He was the former historian, Ed Ketchum. And I worked with Ed on kind of adjusting a little bit here, but this is, what you see here is a little different from the map that you'll see at Monterey Bay these days. This one doesn't have any of the current kind of names of places, European names, but instead shows you kind of the indigenous landscape and the names for the mountain ranges, the names of village sites, and stuff like this. The area was known by the Mutsun people as Popeleochum, which is kind of a name for the broader area of the Monterey Bay. Some people refer to the Monterey Bay as Kalandaruk, which translates to mean, Rook means houses, and Kalanda is ocean, so ocean homes is a name, possibly for a village site as well. A lot of the information about this has been lost because of a couple hundred years of very violent colonial process, which has really kind of wreaked havoc for Native peoples and their cultural memories on things. But fortunately, there is a lot of information that people have been able to kind of preserve and piece together. I know these days people give land acknowledgements. I'm not going to give like a formal one, but I will point out that where we are, and I'll get into more depth on this, but where we are today here in this area was the homeland of a tribe called the Uypi people, Uypi, written by the Spanish, so it would be pronounced as if it was in Spanish, which would, some people say Uypi, but I think it would be more Uypi. And this, the Uypi people kind of lived from about Scotts Creek area north of here down to about Arana Gulch, the harbor. So this whole area here would have been part of their homelands, and they had multiple village sites throughout this area. And I'll talk more about those villages in a bit here. The San Lorenzo name, the name that we know it by, or San Lorenzo, was given to it when the Portola expedition passed through here in 1769. They stopped at the river here on October 17th, which corresponded to the Catholic St. Lawrence Day, right? And so they named it San Lorenzo, and that's kind of the name that's stuck with it ever since. Some years ago, I talked with Lori, maybe 10 years ago, and Lori had asked me, what is the native name of the San Lorenzo? And unfortunately, you know, I'm sure there was a name, but there's nothing that's been recorded or that's known amongst the communities today. So we don't have an alternative name, but the closest that we do have is the name of the village, which was said to have been somewhere here along the mouth of the San Lorenzo, and that was the village of Aulintak, which I'll talk about in a bit. But the founding of the mission here was founded in 1791 And at that point, the Spanish had already founded missions in Monterey and San Francisco and Santa Clara. It's very interesting to dive into these records. You can see that there were, they actually met with the chief of the Uypi and his wife, which is a couple. His name was Soquel, or some variation, Sugert. They wrote it alternatively. And his wife's name was Rizzo-Martinez. And they actually went up to Santa Clara, and their daughters were baptized there. And there's notes in the baptismal registry that said this is the chief of where we're going to put that new mission. And so you can see that the plans are already being put in place to put a mission down here. I theorize it's probably because they were having a hard time reaching the converting, relocating the people of the Santa Cruz Mountain area, and so this is a difficult region. And so they put a mission down here in 1791. And that, of course, completely changed everything very drastically here in Santa Cruz area. I should point out that people of this broader area, we don't know exactly the boundaries, linguistic boundaries, but they spoke a language that is known as today as Awaswas. It could have been a couple different names, but that would be from about Año Nuevo down to Watsonville would be where people spoke the Awaswas language. This is another map. This one was made at the recommendation from a conversation I had with the former chairman of the Amamutsan, Valentin Lopez. And Val asked me if we had any maps that would show like specifically the impact of Mission Santa Cruz and show which tribes were taken into Mission Santa Cruz. A great idea. We didn't have anything visually before that, so I worked with a map maker, Annie Taylor, who had worked with the tribe, and we put together this and color-coded it to kind of show the darker the hues there are, show the larger numbers of people taken from those tribes in there. And I think this is an important map in the sense that when I started researching this, I kind of assumed that the tribes that were impacted by the missions would be the ones right in that region, which of course is the case. But you can see here that geographically, as the years went by, as people were unfortunately dying in large numbers at the missions, the Spanish were increasingly kind of recruiting or sometimes taking whole villages and relocating them from further and further inland here, as you can see. The San Lorenzo River in particular, it intersects with the territories of three distinct tribes. This would be the Uypi people that I mentioned who are at the mouth of the San Lorenzo. But as you go up the river and like the watershed on the northern part, or kind of I guess it would be eastern part of the watershed, it would have intersected with the tribe, or at least a village known as Sayanta or Sayantaka as it's written. This is the namesake of the Zayante River, and then the Zayante Township that's up there get their name from these folks up there. And then it also intersects in like the Boulder Creek and kind of Big Basin area at the head of the river is near a village site that is known as Achistaka. And more recently, I was able to figure out that the Achistaka are actually the same people as the Katoni people who live just north of the Uypi on the coast here. But the Achistaka is their uplands village. That would be roughly in like the Little Basin area for folks who are familiar with that. That would have been that village site. But it was the same people who are kind of moving up and down from the coast in those areas. So it intersects with these three different tribes. Which is kind of fascinating. I mean, it shows kind of the importance of these river systems for tribal members. A bunch of maps here, so I hope you enjoy maps. This is another one that is kind of based on the old Randy Milliken maps that he had made. And this one shows kind of the tribal territories, although this is an older one, so it doesn't have the Katoni and Achistaka sites kind of combined there. It gives you a sense of these in some of the villages. The Uypi people had three different villages that we know the names for. And these were recorded in 1850 when a man named Alexander Taylor, who was going up and down the state of California, early kind of American California, and he ended up, and he was kind of writing about this for a newspaper at the time. And he reported that there were three sites. He named them Aulintak, Chalamu, and Hotroktak. are the three names given to those. And I already mentioned Aulintak, but I didn't translate it. The Aulintak one is the one that was said to be at the mouth of the San Lorenzo, and keeping in mind that for Native people, village sites were not like a fixed point like we have like cities on a map for us, but instead it's a broader region, and they were rotating seasonally between different sites. There's a whole system of living that they had that was much more, I would say, harmonious, right? Like that was not over impacting in the particular regions. And so when they moved back into Aulintak, they wouldn't have gone to the exact same sites that they were at before. They would have burned like the grasslands there to kind of replenish them, and they would rotate around it. So when we think of like a village site, it's kind of a broader kind of area where they were moving within that area. The name Aulintak, the suffix for that is tak, and you see that a lot. I mentioned with Zayanta or Zayantaka, Achistaka. So tak means the place of in the language, and so anytime you see that, it's usually indication that it's a village site. And Aulin, the word Aulon is actually the root word, the abalone. The Spanish name, the abalone, abalones, comes from the word Aulon, which is Aulintak, is the place of the red abalone in particular. And it is true, I've talked to some biologists, they talk about there's a lot of abalone, I think, just up the coast, a little ways from here along West Cliff. And there was recently a commercial abalone place up near Davenport, right? So there's a lot of abalone off this area, so it would make sense. I should point out that oftentimes the names of places usually were kind of referencing to like the particular animals or the environment, right? Some aspect of that area, which is very different from what we have in a place like Watsonville, which is named after Henry Watson, who was a shiesty lawyer who ended up like screwing people out of their lands, you know. So anyway, it makes a little more sense in some ways. So the other names, we don't know the actual translations of Chalamu and Otroktak, but Ed Ketchum, the tribal chair of Amamutsin, has a theory that he shared with me. He thinks Chalamu might translate to the Buckeye gathering place, which does kind of make sense. And then Hotroktak, so Chalamu would have been a little bit north of here, maybe on like the west side, and then Hotroktak would have been like Wilder Ranch area. And that seems to translate to possibly mean the cocoon rattle place, right? They would make rattles out of cocoons. Anyway, those are kind of theories, but it does kind of make sense with the language there. Okay, so thinking about the San Lorenzo and rivers, you know, for indigenous communities, rivers were obviously really important for so many different reasons, but a lot of times rivers were kind of the boundaries between different territories. I mentioned earlier, like for the Uypi, the boundary between the Uypi and the Katoni was right around Scotts Creek, just north of here, so that was kind of one boundary. And then again, the harbor would have been another. So you can see how like territories are kind of bounded by different rivers, river systems. But the San Lorenzo is a little different. It was not like a boundary for the Uypi. It was actually right kind of in the middle of their territory. And so to me, I interpret that as having a little different significance, right? It was a river that they spent a lot of time around and had a lot of, you know, central importance to their world, right? It was right in the middle of their, it's worth pointing out too, I think probably most people know this, but historically the San Lorenzo is not a fixed river, right? It was not until the 1950s that they built those levees after the Christmas floods. And so the river historically would have been a meandering river, right? That would have moved. This whole area like that we're in downtown would have been much more akin to like Neary Lagoon, for folks who know Neary Lagoon, right? So it would have been, well, John Laird was just talking about the wetlands, right? This whole area back then was very much a wetlands type of area. So the Uypi people wouldn't have necessarily lived in like this downtown area, but they would have definitely spent time down here, and this would have been an important area in that sense. It was actually transformed in the Spanish colonial mission system, where they filled in things and created like agricultural fields down here. So a lot of the downtown area became kind of like the crop rows and wheat and beans and different things that were being grown here. For Native people, for the Uypi, the river was a source of a lot of things. This is a drawing by Louis Chorice from the 1820s when he traveled here with the Russian ship and did a bunch of drawings that are really kind of our earliest drawings or representations of Bay Area Ohlone peoples. But the rivers were a source, and this wetland areas were a huge important resource. They were places where people would hunt. I don't know if people have seen that they'd make these kind of duck decoys like out of basketry that are, I think the Natural Museum History has on display there. But they would do, they would hunt there. They would use a lot of like the different like shrubs and poles, like the willow reeds, the tule poles. These were used for like houses, for all sorts of different things. Tule was used for boats too, right? They would make these boats out of tule. You can see some of those on display at different places. I know state parks had one for a while too. So they would use them for basketry materials. And I like this picture, even though this one was drawn up in like San Francisco area. But we know that people down here in the Uypi in particular were people who had boats and used boats. There's this great story from 1811. The Russians were at that point kind of moving down the coast, and they had a bunch of Aleutian, what the Spanish referred to as Russian Indians, but they were Aleutians that they had taken, men that had taken down in their kayaks and bidarkas to seal hunt. And there's this great story that I found in the records in 1811 where the priest is complaining, and they say that the Russians are angry because they say that they call them at this point the Zokel Indians, after the chief, right, Sokel. So the Zokel Indians have stole one of the bidarkas from the Russian Indians. Anyway, it just gives us, there's so little written from the native perspective that you get these little pieces of what was happening in that world. It's kind of interesting. Yeah. So the mission itself, some people might know this, but when the mission was built in 1791, and Melanie Mayer did this great little book on this where she was trying to figure out where exactly the original mission was. But it was built that first year, and then when the rains came and the winter came, it was destroyed, right? It was in the floodplain, and then they ended up relocating it to the bluff the next year. But it probably was like around Cathcart, I think is where Melanie eventually figured it was. But it was down here in kind of the river, in the floodplain area, right? Often the Spanish, the whole colonial approach was to not really necessarily, understand the climate until the trial and error and having it destroyed by the floods, and then relocating and moving up there instead of asking people where a good place to be would be. Mission Hill is worth talking about too. It's uncertain. People ask, might that have been Aulintak? I know talking with Ed Ketchum recently, I know he's pretty convinced it probably wouldn't have been an old village site, but the reality is that Native people lived and were around Mission Hill a long, long time. There's many, many sensitive sites up there, burial sites, quite a few burial sites up there. It certainly would have been a place on that bluff people would have gone, would have spent a lot of time. So I think that's a really important site for Native people. It's very sensitive too. Every time there's any kind of construction and stuff, there's always all sorts of really sensitive sites that are hit, including some recent stuff I know that the tribe is working with lately too. So that's a really important site, although I don't think it necessarily would have been a village site per se. I think people would have lived a little bit more inland and not necessarily right there. Okay, a couple other things, and then if there might be time for questions. Let me just give a little bit of an overview of the history. I was just thinking about the San Lorenzo historically, and some of this might be familiar, but I don't know if people know, but going up the San Lorenzo is, of course, a site for the California Powder Works for many years. Some people don't realize that these days, but in 1863, the California Powder Works was built adjacent to the San Lorenzo, about 3 miles upstream from here. Anyway, a little ways there. The Powder Works was actually a big company. It was like one of the bigger employers of Santa Cruz while it was active. They were making gunpowder for California mining, and this is the early American era, right, where there was all sorts of crazy mining and destroying of like the ecosystems, the hills and everything, as people were trying to find gold all over. But this was one of the big suppliers of this in California here. There was a dam that was constructed in what's now Henry Cowell, just upstream in there, and this would try to raise the water level that they would use in the powder mill. And then sometimes the powder mill would kind of dam up all of the water, and so it would end up stopping the San Lorenzo completely back in those times. It was eventually closed in 1914, and that dam was demolished, but that was there at one point. It's worth noting too that the powder works was a big employer of a lot of the Chinese immigrants who are coming here, and then also a lot of the native community, those who had survived the mission, quite a few of them ended up working at the powder mill too. I'll also mention very briefly, but how many people are familiar with the Venetian Water Carnival that was here? Okay, a handful of people. It's a really cool little piece of Santa Cruz history and San Lorenzo history, but in 1894 there was this large fire. For those who are familiar with Chinese history locally, this is the fire that destroyed the Chinatown that was downtown. But this fire kind of gutted a big part of downtown, and that was the impetus for folks to rebuild the Civic Center in this Renaissance style, and then they started rebranding Santa Cruz as the Florence of the West, and this led to this Santa Cruz Venetian Water Carnival that started in 1895 and became an annual event until 1927, so it ran for almost just over 30 years, and it was inspired by Venice, Italy, created to be kind of an extension of these kind of annual floral affairs that had started at the Fair Pavilion a little earlier. And then with the creation of Venice, California down at LA, that kind of took the steam out of trying to make Santa Cruz into this kind of Venice area here. The last thing I'll talk about too is more recently the Coastal Watershed Council has been working on a series of these little videos that are highlighting kind of different communities' engagement with the river, and they've done they're doing a series of them. I know the one that was on like the history of the Chinese connections here downtown, I guess is already online. I haven't seen it. And then they're working right now, and we'll show you a little clip of one that is focusing on indigenous history here. And they're working on another one that's looking at Latino history and connections with the San Lorenzo. This here is a mural that is downtown there in the Beach Flats area. That is the muralist. Right there is Irene Juarez O'Connell, who's a really phenomenally talented muralist and artist who has been commissioned to do this. So that's something that you all can go check out downtown. And then this is my book cover. People are interested in learning a lot more about Native history. We touched on like 2% of what's in there, but there's definitely a lot more. You can check that out. I think we might have time for a question, so I might have run a little long, yeah.
Hi, my name's Ian. I'm a resident of SoCal. I have been for about like 5 years, and everything you were saying about native land use and kind of community engagement, I've been thinking about, you know, the kind of need in ecological, like kind of conservation for human interaction. Just, you know, thinking about how a lot of these landscapes were shaped by native usage. And I guess my question for you is, you know, I think there's a clear desire for that kind of, you know, work to be done to kind of make these, like, you know, preserves and kind of all these conserved lands, you know, accessible to humans. But I feel like, you know, there is like kind of a limitation with like, you know, it being kind of relegated to like recreation and like parks and stuff. I live right across the street from the Dobbins house, and there's a big gulch that I've brought like the park host for Energy Cummings Park over to. And, you know, when I bring city officials there, there's like kind of this conversation of like, you know, there's this big wildlife corridor right on the border of like kind of community of this like sort of settler society that's not going to move or go anywhere. And everybody's agreed, like, you know, it would take a crew of like the conservation corps, like like 20 dudes, like months, like a month-long operation to kind of get this cleared. You know, it's totally overgrown. And you know, there's so many like areas around town like that you know look like straight like eating candy before like all steam fires. Like, you know, my buddies, you know, again, these areas that traditionally, like we all kind of were talking about, you know, this is an area of land that, you know, there's bulb gardens around it, there's like, you know, buckeye groves. You can see that this is a place that used to be preserved / managed with native kind of land management that kind of just can't be done anymore. Like they were talking about how like this would require a prescribed burn. That would never get the permit if there's like the college community right there, there's an antique store, like there's the SoCal High School right there on Ames Hill. So my question is like, do you think there's the kind of future where, you know, native kind of land management and maybe like uses of the land might be able to do like solutions for problems that face kind of the settler society we live in today? Or will it always like kind of be this thing that like is a necessity of the land that kind of just stands as an obstacle to the necessities of the needs of like our people?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, first of all, I live pretty close. I live in SoCal area too, so I know all those areas you're talking about. Yeah, I think it's a great question. I mean, this is my personal opinion, but I don't think that there is a future without having indigenous land management, right? I think that the way that we're living our world today is not sustainable, right? I mean, I think the extractive kind of colonial model that we've grown up in, right, the world that we've been in, we're seeing this all the time, right? I mean, it's just not one that looks at the long term. It doesn't consider those things. So you talk about prescribed burning. You know, Native peoples had a system of prescribed burning for millennia, right, since time immemorial. That was outlined in 1793. The Spanish prohibited fires, right, after because Native people were using fire as a weapon, right, against the missionization system. People don't realize, but those red tile roofs, that was an innovation because they were using thatched roofs and they were shooting flaming arrows and burning down missions. And so they innovated to use the red tiles to prevent that. Anyway, just an indication of how fire was so central. But it gets outlawed in 1793, and then the Americans kind of upheld that outlaw. So that's part of the reason we have these devastating wildfires. So I think that, you know, there are, right now the Hamilton Tribal Land Stewards are working with like state parks, and they're, you know, they've been doing work up in like Caroste Valley, up in Año Nuevo. And we saw 5 years ago at the CZU fires that area was completely insulated, right? The fires went right up to the area that they had been managing. So it was proof, like I know I was working for State Parks at the time, and State Parks was like, wow, okay, this just demonstrated how impressive and how important this is. So I think there is a push. Isak, that you saw in the video, he has been kind of leading the whole fire management thing, and like I know I talked to him, and he's going out to these conferences, but there is this big movement in California where Native people are leading a charge to kind of return to like fire management, which I think is incredibly important. But I think, yeah, in a broader sense, I would agree with you 100%. I think that we really have to. People are just now starting to realize how ingenious indigenous peoples have been, and how the way that they managed lands was not this haphazard way of just they happen to do it, but they actually had learned this over thousands of years of really refining methods. So the more we can listen to and learn from Native people about how to manage things, I think the more likely it is that we will have a future that we can get to. I think otherwise it's yeah, I think we're not headed in a great direction without that. Yeah, great question. Yeah, thank you all.
Thank you so much, Martin.